So hello and welcome to another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about Aloha Wanderwell, the first woman to drive around the world. And something I like to do on Biographics and our sister channels, Geographics and Top 10s, check them out in the links below, is note that these videos are a team effort. So I'm not the first person to lay eyes on this script. I'm not even the second, the third or fourth. There's about half a dozen people behind the scenes who have seen this script before myself. And of course, the first person to have done that is the original author. In this case, that is Radu Alexander. Check them out at the social media links below, but let's get to it. Brains, beauty and breeches. World tour offer for lucky woman wanted to join an expedition. That was the ad that Aloha Wanderwell saw in 1922, and right away she felt as if it had been written especially for her. She was only 16 years old, but already knew that being a proper young lady was just not the path for her. From a young age, she had an unquenchable thirst for adventure. Aloha was just waiting for the right opportunity. And now she knew that she had found it. 75 countries and 380,000 miles later, Aloha Wanderwell had become the first woman to drive around the world, earning the moniker of the Amelia Earhart of the open road. But before we get to that, we have to, as we always do, start at the beginning with... Aloha Wanderwell is too fitting a name for someone who travelled around the world, so she was of course born with a different name, that name being Idris Garcia Welch on October 13th, 1906 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, to Margaret Headley and Robert Welch, both hailing from the northeast of England. Like me. However, Welch died soon after she was born. In 1908, Margaret married a guy called Herbert Hall, so Aloha grew up as Idris Hall alongside her sister named Margaret, aka Miki. The foursome lived on Vancouver Island, where Herbert Hall worked as a rancher. He came from a posh Nottinghamshire family that was once quite a big deal back in the old country. His grandfather, Thomas Dickinson Hall, was the Lord of Wotton and even served for a brief stint as the Sheriff of Nottingham, just like the Robin Hood stories. Herbert, however, broke off from family tradition and set sail for Canada because he had an inkling for fame, fortune and adventure that he would pass on to Aloha. In 1911, the family took a gamble when they heard rumours that a new railway line would be built on the island. They sold all of their properties and bought a 40-acre promontory on Qualicum Beach. That year, the girls stayed with their relatives while Herbert and Margaret lived out of a tent as they built a cabin on the property, which they then used as temporary shelter while their new family home was being constructed. The sisters didn't particularly mind this. They loved their time at Qualicum Beach, which they spent exploring the forest, paddling in the shallow waters and befriending the local deer with gifts of apples, crackers and beer they stole from their father. Unsurprisingly, they also spent a lot of time at the beach having picnics and listening to music on their gramophone. Young Idris particularly enjoyed a record with ukulele music and would do a hula-style dance to it. She often used to do it to entertain guests, and her mother asked her to do, and I quote, her Aloha dance, which is the origin story of her name, which we'll be using for the rest of this piece. Things were going well, but like many others, their lives changed forever when World War I started. In 1915, Hall joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He died in combat 2 years later at Ypres. This understandably had a devastating impact on Idris for two reasons. The first was the obvious loss of her father figure. Second, this is when she found out that Herbert Hall was not her biological dad. Aloha started to feel like she didn't belong. She had a sense of isolation and wanderlust, which only grew stronger when her mother decided to send her and her sister to a Catholic girls' school in Belgium because Herbert had wanted to give them, and I quote, a continental education. At the school, Miki was the prized pupil, but the same could not be said for her older sister. Aloha had always been a tomboy, and now she was entering her rebellious teenage phase. She didn't like obeying the nuns' orders, she wanted excitement, not piety. She looked up to Hollywood icons like Mary Pickford, not the Mother Superior. Eventually, Aloha got expelled after the headmistress found her diary full of fantastical tales of adventure, including plans to just run away from the school. According to her book, when Aloha was confronted by the Mother Superior, she clocked the nun right on the jaw. This might be a bit of an embellishment on her part, but either way, Aloha was out of the school. The timing worked out pretty well though, because her mother had sold their property in Canada and bought a villa in Nice, where the girls continued their education. It was much more relaxed atmosphere certainly, but still not relaxed enough to quell Aloha's lust for excitement. Then, in 1922, she met Captain Wanderwell. His real name was of course not Captain Wanderwell because that would be too perfect. He was actually born Valerian Johann Pajczynski, and he was born in Poland, if the name Pajczynski didn't give that away. And he later changed his name to Walter Wanderwell. He wasn't a captain of anything, he just liked to be addressed like that because It sounds cool. Also, if anyone wondering, was the guy a captain of anything? No, he just liked being called captain, so styled himself as a captain. Aloha quite liked this and would refer to him as Cap. He had a checkered past, which included a stint in prison for being a suspected German spy during the war. However, when Aloha met him, he was grabbing headlines for taking part in an endurance race around the globe. Aloha first saw him at a screening of his exploits where he signed autographs for her and then pointed out an advertisement in the Paris Herald, looking for a lady secretary to join the Wanderwell expedition. In reality, the woman would serve as part of the undertaking, would have to serve as a secretary, a driver, mechanic, seamstress, saleswoman, interpreter, public speaker, camerawoman, cinematographer, actor, and probably every other job under the sun. This is your basic dog's body job right here. Aloha didn't care though. This was exactly the kind of adventure she dreamt and written about as a child. So on the morning of December 20th, 1922, Aloha met with Captain Wanderwell at the Hotel Normandy in Nice, where he gave her the down low. There will be lots of travelling. Lots and lots of travelling, also lots of filming, lots of taking pictures and giving press interviews, but most importantly of all was selling postcards, brochures, letters and other promotional materials, since that was what would be funding the entire expedition. Aloha was immediately hooked, and the very next afternoon she attended another screening where she'd already began selling merch. She also met two other members of the team, an Italian man she called Il Giornalista and a Texan woman she dubbed La Divorcée. Sure. Aloha then spent the night with the crew and travelled to the town of Menton the following day and a quick dash to Italy after that. That weekend, Aloha went home and told her mother what she'd been doing and about wanting to leave on the expedition. Unsurprisingly, her mother Margaret said no, but this wasn't a hard no, it wasn't like an over my dead body kind of no. And after all, Margaret did kind of understand what was going on in her daughter, the desire to travel, because when she was younger, she had travelled across the Atlantic and Canada by train. She understood the itch that Aloha was feeling, but as a mother, she was understandably concerned for her daughter's safety. Eventually, she agreed to meet with Captain Wanderwell, and he won her over enough for Margaret to agree to a trial run in southern France. Not that it truly mattered, since Aloha had already made up her mind to run away if her mother said no. Anyway, you know, rebellious teenage years and all that. There was just one more thing that Aloha wanted to change. She was looking for a name that was a bit more show business, so she became Aloha Hall for a short time, but eventually adopted Wanderwell soon thereafter, because how Hollywood is that? On December 29th, 1922, Aloha said goodbye to her mother and sister, jumped in the captain's Ford Model T, which was covered in autographs, sponsor logos and advertising slogans, and set off to see the rest of the world. Crew members on the expedition changed frequently. Some got fed up with life on the open road, while others only signed up for certain stretches of the trip. Cap wanted somebody permanent though, somebody who could serve as a recognisable face of the expedition as a whole. And it didn't take long for it to become obvious that Aloha was that someone. A 6 foot tall, drop dead gorgeous blonde with classic Hollywood good looks. That's the kind of person who's going to grab people's attention the world over. The European leg of the journey almost ended as soon as it started. From France, the team drove to Geneva while staying at the Marquise Hotel. The captain leaned out of a windowsill to untie the flag, slipped on an icy windowsill and plummeted through the glass roof of the restaurant below. He was hurt and taken to the hospital, and then to add insult to injury, newspapers around the world reported that Walter Wanderwell had tried to kill himself, with the New York Times running the headline, "World Auto Tourist Suddenly Loses Mind." As for Aloha, she was distraught. She gathered all the promotional material, films and cameras, put them in the car, locked it inside a garage, and then boarded the train home. She feared that her adventure had already come to an end, but a week later she received a telegram from Switzerland reading, and I quote, "I'm ready for work, come as soon as you can. Captain Wanderwell." Of course, that was all that was needed for Aloha to rejoin the expedition, and the next few trips were far more pleasant. In Paris, Aloha met Hollywood icon Rudolph Valentino. In Beziers, she attended Mardi Gras. Then in Barcelona, the Wanderwell team stayed at the swankiest hotel in town and were greeted by the Lord Mayor himself. Aloha was slowly getting used to driving the Model T with all of its quirks, such as having to drive backwards uphill when low on gas because the tank had no fuel pump to feed gas to the engine and instead relied only on gravity. By the time the team had left Spain, Cap had decided to add a third car to the expedition, which meant that Aloha would become a full-time driver. A regular day typically involved travelling from town to town, drumming up as much local interest as possible, and then in the evening staging a lecture, a screening, or a vaudeville show. Whatever would bring in the biggest crowd so the team could sell their merch and promote their sponsors. Sometimes this worked well, like in Barcelona, other times not so well, like in Madrid and Pamplona. In Zaragoza, things went even worse as Cap had left for France to obtain a third car. Meanwhile, the other two members of the team, a man named Armstrong and a young woman named Fate, announced that they intended to get married and abandon the expedition, leaving Aloha all alone. in a country that she wasn't familiar with and a language she didn't speak. With few other options, Aloha returned to France. Again, she thought about going home, but one meeting with the captain had her swayed once more, especially after seeing the new car and realising that it would be all hers. She would later be quoted as saying, "My very own jolly boat. I quickly took an initial fling behind the wheel. She purred. With muffler, her throb was smooth. She was built for daring do." Yeah, I understood what that meant. Germany represented the next leg of their journey, but this was a country that had been destroyed by World War I and was experiencing hyperinflation. As Aloha discovered, for many Germans, bread had become a luxury, so few of them had any interest or the means to buy a brochure. Despite that, she still put on, along with the crew, 2 shows in Hanover and Berlin to quite large crowds. Even if they didn't sell anything, they could at least promote their sponsors. And hyperinflation in post-World War I Germany is a fascinating topic I've written about in the past and would love to cover as the host on the sister channel Geographics. But a few facts about that period that still live in my mind rent-free are that money became effectively worthless to the point where it was cheaper to burn stacks of money than it was to buy firewood, because the firewood would have cost billions upon billions of marks. They wouldn't count money at restaurants and grocers. They would just weigh it instead because it was quicker. They would have to announce prices in restaurants by the hour and would write them on a blackboard outside of the restaurant and have a waiter stand up and tell you, so people would have to eat their meal very quickly. Workers would have to renegotiate their wages at the start of every single day, and when it reached the absolute worst point, by the hour, because you could go in the morning, earn several billion marks, and by the end of the day that wouldn't be enough to buy a loaf of bread. There's also like images out there of people wallpapering their walls with marks, children like playing blocks essentially with big stacks of cash because they were effectively worthless, and it was cheaper just give them a big stack of cash to play with than it would have been buy them a single toy. A single sausage bought at the apex of the inflation would cost more than an entire house. It's a fascinating period of history that I would love to go more in depth on at a future point, but that's not the story for today, so let's get back to Aloha Wanderwell. In Poland, the expedition received a much more lavish welcome since Cap was Polish and had 2 brothers in the military there. They staged big shows in Warsaw and Krakow, and then they were preparing to cross the Carpathian Mountains into Romania. However, Aloha was feeling kind of down because her feelings for Cap, which had become romantic in nature, went wholly unreciprocated. Even her 17th birthday had come and gone without a mention. In Krakow, Aloha went out all night with an officer, hoping to elicit some worry, maybe some jealousy from Cap. However, she was greeted more with the anger of an outraged parent, and that was just too much for her to deal with. The next day, Aloha packed her bags, went to the train station, and returned home to Nice. She had left the Wanderwell expedition. Without Aloha, the expedition went on, passing through Eastern Europe, Turkey, the Levant, and into Egypt. The team received a hero's welcome in Alexandria, more so than in any other country they visited thus far. This included a generous sum for expenses, plus the promise of another payment should they also come to Cairo, plus some spare parts for the cars, and just to top it all off, a 1-ton truck of supplies. Everything was going well for them, but the same could not be said for Aloha back in Nice. Quite predictably, she got bored. It had only been 3 months when she announced that she was leaving again, looking to get back on the expedition over in Egypt. Aloha's reunion with Cap in Cairo was friendly, but still not quite as friendly, to keep it PG, as she would have hoped. After an extensive filming and sightseeing tour in Egypt, the plan was to go to the Suez and take a ship to India. But there were a few, shall we say, bureaucratic snafus with their passports, and they had to wait for 3 days in Suez, living on the deck of the Borealis. During that time, almost the entire team left, leaving just Aloha, Cap, and a mechanic named Jiroki. So they couldn't even get any alone time, the mechanic was right there. The trio then travelled to Massawa in Eritrea, which was an Italian colony back then. There, they secured passage across the Red Sea into Yemen, and from there they sailed to Bombay, or Mumbai as we call it nowadays. The reduced crew meant that she had to drive one of the Fords all on her own, and to be honest, things didn't exactly go swimmingly. Remember though, Aloha was driving a Model T with dodgy steering that was old and clunky even back then. Not to mention that the city streets were filled with pedestrians, bicycles, carts, and even animals that didn't regard the automobile as anything worth paying attention to. At one point, Aloha got so flustered that she forgot what side of the road to drive on and clipped into a gharry. And in case you have no idea what a gharry is, because I sure as hell didn't until I saw what it was in the script, it's a type of horse-drawn cab. And it wasn't long before 150 angry locals had surrounded Aloha's car, but her knight in shining armour came in the form of, to quote her, a large gentleman who hopped out of the car, caught the driver by the neck and hurled him across the street. That cleared the way, and I proceeded. The trek through India was long and arduous, and the crew was racing against the approaching monsoon season. There were highlights like filming snake charmers at the Taj Mahal and resting at a luxurious old mansion in Allahabad. She also received the gift of a pet monkey. She called it Kim. She knitted it a sweater. It was adorable, but still monsoon season. So it was nice, yes, but there were still perils such as getting stuck in the Godavari River, having to drive through plague-infested towns, just all that good stuff. But everything ended well, with their Indian journey concluded with a stay at the Grand Hotel in Calcutta before flying to Burma and then taking a steamer to Singapore. So this was the summer of 1924, and Cap wanted to reach America by the end of the year. They could have done it right now, but Wanderwell couldn't resist the temptation of crossing China by car, something he'd been warned would be completely absurd, making a quick stop in the USSR. Therefore, in August, Aloha was in Beijing, ready to set off on another laborious journey. As it happened, they were preparing to traverse China, right as the Second Zili-Fengtian War started, and the two factions fought for control of Manchuria. Here, Aloha describes the ordeal, and I quote, "Once again, our main anxiety was avoiding that week's bloody war zone. Corpses lay half-covered, some sat bolt upright in ditches, hideous fly-blown limbs scattered by explosions. Sometimes we heard the boom of artillery." So, yeah, not exactly a pleasant experience, but the Feng-Xian faction did welcome them with open arms, gave them supplies, provided them with a ton of great footage, and granted them safe passage through their territory. In mid-October, the Wanderwell expedition reached Vladivostok and had no intention of crossing Russia by car, because that would be insane. They popped in for a quick hello, just enough time to celebrate Aloha's 18th birthday with a fancy dinner and have her made an honorary colonel by the Soviet army for being, and I quote, "the first demoiselle to pilot a motorcar to Siberia." After that, it was off to Japan. They found the Japanese people extremely enthusiastic about their adventure, and they were selling pamphlets and brochures faster than they could print them off. In Tokyo, at the Nippon Theatre, they were paid $1,000 for 10 shows, by far the highest rate they'd ever earned. It was very tempting to stay in Japan, but the expedition had a schedule to keep. Plus, Cap and Aloha were hopeful that their next leg of the journey would be their most profitable yet: their return to America. The Wanderwell expedition arrived in San Francisco on January 5th, 1925, after a quick stop in Honolulu. They were hoping for a big welcome and tons of publicity, but instead, they were arrested. Cap was accused of white slavery under the Mann Act. It was around this time that Aloha found out about his seedy past by reading about it in the papers. For the first time, her confidence in Cap was shaken, but she was in love with him, so stuck by his side. Finally, her dedication paid off. First, they were both released without charge, since the police had no evidence against them. She had travelled with him willingly. Then they set off for Hollywood, a place Aloha had always fantasized about visiting. And lastly, Cap proposed to her. They got married in April in Riverside and went on to have 2 children together, Valerie and Niall. A few years earlier, this would have been pretty much everything Aloha wanted, but looking back on it later, she barely talked about her marriage in her memoir. She knew that Cap slept around with many of the other women on their crew. She also knew that the proposal was mainly out of convenience, not genuine love and affection for her, mostly so they could travel freely in America from state to state without risking another arrest under the Mann Act. It's not surprising then that Aloha showed no grief a few years later in 1932 when Cap was murdered aboard their yacht. She was even considered a suspect for a while a man named William James Guy was tried for the crime but later acquitted. Nobody was ever convicted, so the murder of Walter Wanderwell remains a cold case to this day. But it's not his story, it's Aloha Wanderwell, so let's get back to that. And that was the future, so for now, the newlyweds still had all of America ahead of them. Aloha used her time in Hollywood quite wisely, learning film editing techniques to improve the quality of their footage, but also got to meet one of her idols, Mary Pickford, at the United Artists Studio. Pickford's husband, fellow A-lister Douglas Fairbanks, had quite a fascination with their adventurous expedition, and the Hollywood couple even christened the Wanderwell's 4th Model T, dubbed Miss Los Angeles. The first leg of the trip through Sierra Nevada mountains was also the most arduous. From Nevada onwards, the going was a lot smoother, which is good news for Aloha since she was pregnant. The team got bigger and 2 more cars were added to the expedition. As Cap predicted, their shows were big hits in almost every city they visited: Salt Lake City, Denver, Kansas City, St. Louis, in Detroit. They even got a big parade through downtown. That's where they officially ended the $1 million wager the endurance race had started before Aloha had joined. So they then met with Henry Ford, who accepted one of their first Model Ts as a gift for the Ford Museum. Now technically, the expedition had come to a close, which worked out well since Aloha was too ill and too pregnant to keep going. It was time for her to settle down somewhere, which she did in Miami, where she gave birth to her first child. But of course, this didn't last, as she still had the adventure bug. First, the Wanderwells made a voyage to Cuba, then they travelled to the east coast of the United States and on to Canada. This, however, was just an appetizer for the main course: Africa. In October 1926, the Wanderwells sailed from New York to Africa, intending to travel from Cape Town to Cairo. But Aloha's second pregnancy delayed the new expedition, so she spent the first half of 1927 in South Africa, joined by her mother and sister. In May, however, she was raring to go. This trip was a lot smoother than the previous ones, mainly because they weren't hurting for funds and supplies anymore. Aloha could focus her time on shooting films instead of selling brochures. In total, she made a dozen movies about her global adventures, most of which are now preserved at the Library of Congress, where, they'll probably last for longer than anyone watching this. During their travels, they passed by Mount Kilimanjaro, filmed the Maasai tribe in the Serengeti, and Aloha even fought a bout of malaria. The expedition drove the eastern coast of Africa, passing through Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia. Only Sudan was left before reaching Egypt, but the team received some disturbing news in Ethiopia. A violent uprising had erupted in Sudan, with reports coming in of European tourists being killed. As far as Aloha could remember, this was the only time she ever saw Cap rattled by an obstacle they'd encountered, and they cancelled their trip on the spot. Instead, they drove back to Kenya and secured passage on a steamer back to France. In December 1927, Aloha Wanderwell was in Nice, finally back in the place where her long journey had started 5 years earlier. The next few years were quieter as Aloha worked on her movies, but in 1930, Cap had another idea. South Africa. It made sense, right? Specifically, they were going to trek through the Amazon rainforest in search of Captain Percy Fawcett, a famed explorer who'd vanished a few years earlier while looking for the legendary lost city of Z. The group left in March of 1931, no more Model Ts this time. Instead, they flew a seaplane straight to the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, where Fawcett had disappeared. Spoiler alert, they didn't find him. However, they did meet the indigenous Bororo people. A few gifts were exchanged, and this quickly eased the tension, and the crew was allowed to stay in the village. Aloha even made a movie about the whole thing, called The Last of the Bororos, which represented the earliest footage of the tribe. Not only that, but the Bororo chief even told them what had happened to Fawcett and his crew. They'd all drowned in a whirlpool. No evidence for this has ever been found, but it's as likely as any other story. Overall, the Wanderwell South American trip was a success, even if it didn't accomplish the original goal, which, to be honest, nobody really expected them to do. It was mostly just a publicity stunt. So what was next for the Wanderwells? Well, Cap toyed with the idea of buying a schooner to sail the South Seas, but as we mentioned earlier, the adventure of the Wanderwells came to a sudden and abrupt halt in 1932 when Walter Wanderwell was murdered. Also, as we said, Aloha wasn't really the grieving widow, and when the scandal died down, she married another man named Walter Baker and stayed married for 62 years. Her time as Aloha Baker was decidedly quieter, and she pursued a career in journalism and radio broadcasting. She continued to give lectures on whole screenings of her adventures until 1980, when she delivered her last presentation at the Museum of Natural History in Los Angeles, aged 74. She died on June 4th, 1996, aged 89, but will forever be remembered as Aloha Wanderwell, the world's most travelled girl, as I'm now going to dub her the final boss of girls on Tinder. 30 countries by 30, eh? Yeah, get on Aloha Wanderwell's level. I hope everybody out there found this video to be entertaining, informative, and educational. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things, and if you are inclined to agree, you can go let the author Radu Alexander know on their social media links provided below. You can also find mine down there, links to other stuff you can use to support the channel and our sister channels, Geographics and Top 10s. Click the like button for liking, subscribing for subscribing to more content like this, and comment below with feedback, suggestions, other ideas you'd like us to cover. But as I always like to say to everyone watching, right to the end, go out there and have the day that you deserve. Cheers!